Hello and welcome back to another Scratchboard tutorial for beginners. In this lesson, we will be creating a raccoon with the reference image by Chris Ensminger from Unsplash, and I will add the link to download below. Today we will be using all the tools in my Scratchboard Starter Kit, which includes a 5x7 scratchboard, transfer paper, a number 11 X-Acto knife, a 1RL and 5RL tattoo needle, an S12 microblading tattoo needle, fiberglass brush, scratch nib and pen, and a brush. Also note that the extra thin fiberglass brush was added to the kit after this tutorial was created, so if you have that, please get that out as well. You'll also want to grab a pen, masking or painter's tape, and scissors, which are not included. There's also a bonus step at the end for those of you who have Black India ink and want to add more contrast. If you are joining from having purchased my Scratchboard Starter Kit, please ensure you have watched the Scratchboard for Beginners introduction video where I go over techniques for each of the tools and handling instructions. If you are interested in purchasing my Scratchboard Starter Kit, I will add the link to purchase straight from my website below. I also have a Scratchboard Tools page on my website that has direct links to purchase everything we are using. To start, let's go ahead and cut out our line art and reference image. For this one, I'm going to leave about an inch or so of excess paper on the left side of the line art sheet. If you do not have my starter kit and are transferring directly from the image, just make sure to crop and set the image to 5x7 size before you print. I'm going to go ahead and put 4 pieces of masking tape off to the side. Let's also cut our transfer paper to size. As mentioned in the last tutorial, ensure that when you are taping the transfer paper to the board, that it has the chalky or graphite side down. You can always use a tester board to do a test mark first. I will wrap over about 1 inch of my transfer paper over the side of the board, pull it taut, and tape the bottom as well. And again, we're also being careful not to press too hard down with our fingers on the top of the board so we don't leave any white smudges. As we get going with tracing our subject onto the board, just a reminder that my videos are designed similar to how an in-person class would be. I will show you the technique for a section, and then you can pause the video and try it yourself, completing the rest of the section. This piece took me about 2.5 hours, and as a beginner, I would anticipate this to maybe take you around 3 to 4 hours. So go at your own pace, watch the technique, pause when you are working on a section, and then continue on. Remember, with this white transfer paper, you don't need to press too hard, but I would recommend using your tester board to test out whichever transfer paper you are using to see what kind of pressure you need. I never trust myself in lifting my reference image up once I start tracing to see what it looks like because I'm way too scared of it not lining up when I place it back down, so I try to get it all out in one shot. Hopefully, once you get through these initial tutorials, if you want to continue on in building your skills as an artist, I definitely recommend watching some drawing or sketching tutorials. Even though we are transferring from the image, learning proportions and how to draw will tremendously help you grow in any medium. If you sketch your own piece, you would do a similar technique where you would either print a copy of it or make line art and print that, unless you want to use the sketch itself, and you would then transfer that to the board. Alright, and there we have it, and now we are ready to go. But I'm going to put my glove on. Again, this is optional, but I highly recommend it if you don't want to get black ink all over your hand. And we are going to start with the number 5 tattoo needle. I almost always start with the reflection in the eyes. And I'm not really doing a varied hatching technique, I'm just kind of filling in the areas. Most of my lines are kind of just going parallel with one another. Now I'm making my way down to the white part of the eye. With this transfer paper, it might be a little bit hard to tell if I'm really doing anything, but I am pretty much removing those lines and filling in what's in between them. And if you're having a hard time removing the little outline, you can also take your microblading tattoo needle and use that. That's usually good at removing the transfer lines. And now we are going back in with the X-Acto knife to add the brighter parts of the reflection of light in the eye. I am now working on filling in the bottom eyelid, and I am not using any kind of hatching technique. I'm just kind of doing some line work straight across. Now I'm going to start working on the highlights on the nose. I'm still using a number 5 tattoo needle, but mine comes out quite a bit lighter than I would have liked, so you might actually want to go in with the number 1 tattoo needle first. That way the lines are a bit finer. I will use the black India ink after to darken it up a bit, but again, if you want to start a little bit lighter, go ahead and use that number 1. Now on the highlights on the side of the nose that we just did, I kind of just used some line work. I didn't really do any type of hatching or stippling, but now that I'm moving on to the frontal part of the nose, I do end up using some more stippling techniques here. In some future tutorials, I'll actually show you a stippling technique for noses with the extra thin fiberglass brush. That's one of the tools I mainly use for most animal noses, but noses can be really tricky. I really didn't get into a good routine with noses until this year, and up until then, I always used different tools and did something different, and even now, not all animal noses, of course, are the same, so some will require different tools, but it's really nice once you find the tools that you like to work with the most. Now with my microblading tattoo needle, I'm just going to start on that little fur line right above the nose. Here is what we have so far. Now we'll start filling in the fur on the side of the nose. I'm just taking my microblading tattoo needle and doing an upward motion of the direction of the fur. When we get to the areas where the whiskers start, I'm going to leave a black line that's untouched. I always go in with the brightest whites first and work on those, and then once that's done, we'll go in and fill in the more shaded areas after. Let's go ahead and fill in this little white section of fur on the right side of the mouth before we start brightening everything up. Alright, let's go ahead and get out our fiberglass brush to start brightening up this white. If you have the extra thin fiberglass brush, I would recommend using that one instead of the larger one. And when we go in, we're going to be pressing pretty hard because this is a pretty white area. And remember that when we are brushing the debris off the board, that we are doing it gently and away from our face. This regular size fiberglass brush does the trick, but because this is such a smaller piece, the extra thin fiberglass brush is going to be much easier to control. But you'll definitely have a need for this one in larger pieces. Again, apologies for the camera shaking here. I didn't realize with my desk tripod that it was going to be shaking this much, so I'll be changing that for future tutorials. Alright, let's go ahead and grab our scratch nib, and we are going to start adding in some texture where we use the fiberglass brush. Now this is going to really brighten up this area, so you don't need to press too hard, just make sure that you're using the correct side of the nib and you're going to get that really bright texture. As I'm going in this area, I'm still not going to go over the black line areas where the whiskers are. We're not going to fill that in just quite yet. Also be mindful of the little black area where the bottom lip is. Now we're going to use an X-Acto knife to start blending in those darker whisker areas. I'm going to stop that blending in right before I get to the bottom lip, but I am going to add some really fine hairs on the top lip going down. And then I'll add some more fine strands on the chin. I'm going to start going back over that little area of fur right above the nose. I'm going to be adding in some highlights and also blending in the sides where it meets the white part of the fur. Now we're going to go in with our number 5 tattoo needle up the frontal part of the face, and this is a black section of fur, so we're going to go in pretty light here. And we're starting with the brightest highlights first. Even with areas that look totally black on images, there is still usually going to be some texture there unless you're using a really dramatic lighting technique. So we're starting with the main highlights, and then we're going to go in and fill in the darker areas with more spread out strands of fur later. Now we're going to continue going in lightly around the eye. As we start making our way to this darker section, start making your lines a bit more spread out. Now with our X-Acto knife, we're going to start adding those random, really bright single strands of fur. Remember that with any part of the animal, especially with areas like these, you do not need to match the reference photo to a T. Just go with the flow and do what feels natural. We'll stop there for now and now get out our microblading tattoo needle. We're going to start with the white area of fur that's around the middle part of the face, starting with the eyebrows. And you'll see that we're not really doing any kind of hatching technique here. It's really just putting in that base layer. Because this is a really white section, I'm just trying to scrape off quite a bit of ink. Let's do the same for the white around the ears, and we're going to switch directions if you look at the reference photo and start with an upward motion. Let's get our fiberglass brush back out, or our extra thin fiberglass brush if you have it, and we'll start going back over those areas. Let's now take our scratch nib and add some textured highlights over the blended fiberglass areas. And before we move on to the next section, I'm going to use my microblading needle to blend in this dark section. Let's grab our scratch nib again and work our way to the ears, adding in those textured highlights. Now we're going to take our microblading needle and start adding in those mid-tones between the highlight and the darkest inner part of the ear. And again here, I'm not really using a hatching technique, I'm kind of just filling in the area and blocking it out, because we're going to go in with an X-Acto knife here in just a minute to add in the details. So now now with our X-Acto knife, we're going to build on that texture and start adding in some more individual strands of fur. I end up going quite a bit lighter here. If you want to leave it darker, go ahead and just make sure that your lines are a bit more spaced out and you're not covering as much area. And then we'll do the same for the other side by starting with our microblading needle and then moving to the X-Acto knife. And then I'm going to top off the ears with the brightest highlights using the scratch nib. I am now going to make my way back down, working on the forehead area and using the microblading needle to add in that base layer. Now let's get out our X-Acto knife and start adding in a second layer of brighter fur across the forehead. And as you can tell by this section, it's not fully white. There's a good mix of black and white strands of fur, so I'm going to make my marks a little bit more spread out. I am also kind of blending in that edge of the whitest part of the fur with the section that we're doing. There's a bit of a darker section here. I'm being careful not to etch too much off, but to still give it some texture. Now we're going to use our number 5 tattoo needle to start filling in this black fur area between the ears. Even though this is a really dark patch of fur, we still need to give it texture. We can always go back in with India ink later to make it darker, but we do want to add some texture in here. Now we're going to get out our scratch nib and start adding in the brightest speckles of fur. This is always one of my favorite parts, adding in the brightest little details. I just noticed this little section that I want to use my X-Acto knife to blend in before we keep going. Alright, let's start using our microblading needle to start adding in a base layer of fur around the body. Now the outside of the fur is a bit brighter than the inner part, so I'm going to start spreading my lines out a bit more as we start working our way down to the chest area. As I've mentioned before, we don't need to match the reference photo to a T. Just get an idea of the direction of the fur, but in terms of the lighter and the darker areas, just do what feels natural. Let's take our X-Acto knife and start going in with a second layer with more defined strands of fur. Now let's take our fiberglass brush and start blending in some of these lighter areas. And again, if you have the extra thin fiberglass brush, use that one. Again, my apologies for the camera shaking. Let's go ahead and get out our X-Acto knife and we'll start adding in some more individual strands of fur over the blended areas and also blending in those edges. As we continue to work on this section, one thing that I recommend doing is on occasion, make sure you step back from your work and look at it from a little bit further of a distance. You'll usually catch some things that might look off from a different view. Or another thing that you can do is turn it upside down and look at it that way. I know that sounds a little bit funny, but trust me when I say that sometimes when you look at things upside down, you can actually catch things that look off or out of proportion. You can see that this section is starting to look quite a bit better now that we're going in with our X-Acto knife, and this is probably our third layer now. So again, sometimes things just stay in what I call alien stage for a while as you're building up those layers. Now let's go in with our scratch nib and start adding in those individual brightest highlights. I just noticed that I wanted to add a few more highlights where the eyebrows are, so I'll do that real quick. Alright, it is officially whisker time. I a lot of times like to use a tester board to do some test marks first, but again, you don't have to get it exactly like the reference photo. Just get a general idea for how long they are and then go to town. And of course, we are going to use our scratch nib for this. And I'm actually going to use my scratch pen now to do some of the smaller whiskers. I'm going to make some of these thicker ones a little bit brighter. I am now going to sign my initials with my scratch pen, and that wraps up the main part of our tutorial. For this bonus section, we are going to go in with some black repair ink to add a black wash to get more contrast in shading. I'm going to give it a shake and just do about 2 drops into the tray. And then using the dropper, I'm going to add 1 drop of water to dilute it a little bit. And using a fine watercolor paintbrush, I'll mix it around a little bit and I'll give a little bit of a test on a paper towel before I put it to the board. If it's a bit too opaque, I'll just dab it in the water a little bit again. As mentioned in the last tutorial, it's going to come out quite a bit dark when we add it to the board, but it will dry a little bit lighter. And of course, we're going to go back over this with our X-Acto knife or other tools to add back in some texture. I am also going to darken up the nose and areas of the eyes a little bit. I also want to touch up all of the black fur. I'm going to make that a bit darker, so now it still has some texture, but I definitely want it a little bit darker. Now let's take our X-Acto knife and start adding in another layer of fur over the black washed areas. This is really going to give it a lot more depth. And that fully wraps up our raccoon tutorial. I hope you had fun learning different fur textures and bringing this little guy to life. As always, I will put the links to purchase my Scratchboard Starter Kit as well as all the tools we used on my website below. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to be notified of future tutorials.